Hello everyone, today we are going to be reading chapter 6 of Brian's Hunt. So let's see what happens next. Chapter 6. When he took his bow and quiver in the dawn light, the dog tried to follow him. "No, you have to stay," Brian tried to tell her, then held out his hand and said more firmly, "Stay." But the dog had gotten to her feet, and still favoring her wounded side, had tried to follow Brian out of camp. Finally, Brian took an anchor line and fashioned a lawn slip collar and a leash and tied the dog to the front of the canoe. The dog could easily chew through the cord and follow him anyway, but she finally seemed to understand, with the line tied, that she was supposed to stay. At first she sat and watched while Brian walked away, and then she lay down. Brian had left her enough slack so she could get to the water and drink, and once in the brush, Brian peeked back, well out of sight, and the dog got up, drank a bit, then lay back down and seemed to go to sleep. Brian worked carefully, slowly, used his best abilities to watch for sign, studying everything he could, and found almost nothing to help him in the mystery of the dog. He started with a small circle, or half circle, since it ran from the lakeshore out 300 yards and around the back to the lakeshore on its first loop. He saw the dog's tracks in soft mud in a small clearing coming from the north. He began to work in that direction, making small arcs, but he found only one more mark, again to the north about 100 yards from the first one. A dog footprint in soft dirt and just a tiny touch of blood on a leaf. That was it. It would have been easier to fall in the fall, and of course much easier in the winter, in snow. In the fall there were no leaves, and the grass died back, and it was much easier to see things. Now, with thick foliage, you had to be standing almost on top of a track to see it, and he could find no more. Maybe, probably, the dog had come from the north. That was it. He didn't know from where, how far, or even if it was that true direction. The dog might have come from the east and turned south when it heard or smelled Brian, or from the west. And no deer either. Oh, he saw a sign. He found one pile of dung that was still warm to the touch, but the brush was too thick to see a deer, let alone get close enough for a shot. He came on a snowshoe rabbit and decided to take it. He changed to a field point arrow. He had been walking with a broadhead ready in the bow, but the arrow caught a twig on the way and deflected slightly, so the rabbit was hit low in the gut and had time to scream before he got a second arrow in and killed it. They gave piercing screams sometimes when they died. Brian had heard it many times at night when predators caught them. It was nerve-wrenching and sounded like a baby screaming for its mother. He hated it. But more to the point, the scream. And this was probably why it had evolved, alerted all animals within a quarter mile that a predator was hunting, and that was the end of hunting, for two reasons. 1, all the small animals went into hiding, and the deer left the area. 2, the scream brought other predators that were curious about the kill. All wolves, coyotes, hawks, cats, weasels, fox, owls, eagles, marten, fisher, any predators in the immediate area headed for the scream, and that ensured that the rest of the small animals stayed in hiding. Probably the only exception to the rule were ruffed grouse, which seemed to be so dumb that nothing really affected them. You really gotta do that right now? Sorry, Paws is going crazy right now. He's got a tunnel he keeps diving into. Probably the only exception to this rule was the ruffed grouse, which seemed to be so dumb that nothing really affected them. But they had excellent camouflage covering, and in this thick foliage it would be next to impossible to see one, though they had good meat, dark meat. So rabbit it was, and fish, and aside from chastising himself for making a shot when there was a twig in the way, Brian was grateful and thanked the rabbit. He worked his way back to the campsite, keeping one eye open for a grouse, but he saw none. He found the dog sitting by the end of the canoe, still tied. She had heard the rabbit scream, and Brian coming and gotten up to greet him. "Hi, dog," he said. "We have food. I'll get you some more in a bit and make a stew." The dog wagged her tail and stood, moved against the rope, and Brian untied her and had to lift the rabbit high to keep the dog away from him. "Not raw," he said, "not the meat. I'll give you the guts in a minute." He set his bow aside, took out his knife, and made a neat incision up the middle of the carcass, scooped the entrails, heart, liver, and lungs out, and gave them to the dog, which virtually swallowed them whole, then cocked her head, tail wagging gently in the puppy begging stance, asking for more. Some manners. Brian smiled and thought of himself when he had first come to the bush. Watching a dog eat raw guts would have brought his stomach up. But he had seen both wolves and coyotes kill, and the entrails were their favorite part, and this dog was more wolf than not, a pure, friendly carnivore. He skinned the rabbit and stretched the skin high in the tree to dry. The hide was thin and fragile and very far from prime and would not wear well, but he had in mind trying to make some lures with the hair and tiny hooks he had brought to see if he could use a willow as a pole and fly fish some of the streams between the lakes for trout. He had seen them often beneath the canoe, some of them quite large, but they were very spooky and didn't seem to want worms for bait. They wouldn't stand for a shot with an arrow. He made a fire and put some water on it, using his largest aluminum pot, and dumped the rabbit carcass in whole, then covered it with a lid and slid down around the outside about an inch to keep the ashes out. Then he took one of his fish arrows without the bow, left the dog on the bank, and let the canoe drift out to shore a short distance into the lily pads, held the arrow over the side with the triple barbed point about a foot under water, and wiggled the point he held it still, wiggled it again. And here they came, small bluegills and sunfish, 4 or 5 inches long, so curious they couldn't stand not to get close. And with a sharp motion, he jabbed the point down and took one in the side, flipped it on into the boat, pulled the point out, and put the arrow back in the water. In 20 minutes, he had 10 fish. He took them to shore, scaled them with the back edge of his knife, split them neatly, and fed the guts to the dog, again before he dropped the fish, heads and fins and all, into the stew, which was boiling nicely. From his pack he threw a handful of rice. "To give it body," he said, smiling to the dog, and then, "Come here, here." And the dog came to him and leaned against his leg with her good side and held her head up to be petted. "You're a friendly girl, aren't you?" Brian rubbed her ears and studied the wound in the bright daylight. The sewing didn't look half bad, but now he could see that there were other lines as well, scratches, as if the dog's side had been hit with a small, very deadly rake. "Something with claws," he said. "Not dogs, not wolves, not teeth. Cat? Big cat? Panther or bear?" There it was again, bear. It almost had to have been a bear, and either the dog ran off from its home for some reason and into a bear, or what? Was attacked and then ran off? No, he shook his head, absent-mindedly petting the dog. "I wish you could talk. This doesn't make any sense at all." The pot on the fire boiled, and he used a stick under the wire handle to lift the lid off and check the contents. The rabbit meat had started to separate from the bones, and the fish were right on the edge of disintegrating, so he set the pot aside to cool and threw some green leaves under the hot coals. The day was starting to warm up, and the blackened horse and deer flies were getting active. The smoke would keep them at bay while he stewed and the dog ate. Then what? He had a friend now, a new friend. Thinking, his first dog, although technically she really wasn't a pet and truly belonged to herself more than she did to Brian. But she was a friend in need, and as the cliche said, a friend in need was a friend indeed. The cut seemed to be starting to heal, although he worried about the flies and thought of boiling up some kind of mud to sterilize it and put it over the cut to keep them off. In a week or so, he would cut the stitches out. But he would need more food now than he did just for himself. And for that reason, he thought he felt a sense of urgency that he had not felt before, a need to go, to move. And there was no real reason for it, and yet it was there, and the odd feeling, the odd push in his mind. No plan, no direction, just a strange unease, as if there was something he needed to see or do, or hear or feel somewhere. Where? All right. From the sparse sign Brian had found, it seemed that the dog had come from the north. So no, not just he anymore, they would head north. The Cree summer camp was up there on the Arrowhead Lake with the island, maybe 20-30 miles. He would go see his friends, and maybe they would know where the dog came from, and even if they didn't, he might be able to meet Susan Kigwadush and tell her about the beauty mark. Now they could eat the stew, and he would make a sterile mud pack for the wound, and they would head north, just a nice leisurely trip to see old friends. But still he found himself pushing, hurrying, and he didn't really know why. All right, that's the end of chapter 6. We'll read chapter 7 next time. See you guys in the next video.